In order to understand this manual, this U.S. Army Guerrilla Warfare Handbook Manual, which on the cover says raids and ambushes, communications, psychological operations, demolition, counterintelligence, and mining and sniping, I purchased two other manuals, two other books, Army Special Operations Forces Unconventional Warfare, September 2008, Headquarters Department of the Army, and the U.S. Army Special Forces Guide to Unconventional Warfare. Now, keep in mind the whole time that there are a bunch of sissies, bisexuals, racists, and feminists who are ultimately setting the political, social, religious, and economic agendas for the nation, using the military to enforce it. And in the 2008 book I told you, I brought up, they point out quite clearly that the Army is the last line of control to maintain the internal organization of a nation. So with that being said, page 169, U.S. Army Guerrilla Warfare Handbook, Department of the Army. Okay, I'm just going to read you 169 to 176, the whole chapter. Chapter 9, Psychological Operations in Support of Unconventional Warfare. Unconventional warfare involves ideological, religious, political, and social factors which promote intense emotional partisanship. Resistance organizations tend to attract personnel who accept violent change as a means of social action. They are motivated by hope for change. But the fluid nature of resistance activity, the alternate periods of isolation and combat, the surreptitious life make resistance personnel particularly susceptible to propaganda effects. The ideological and political factors associated with resistance activity create a fertile field for propaganda. Members of resistance movements are active propagandists. Hence, we find paralleling the guerrilla military effort, a propaganda effort conducted by all resistance elements seeking to gain support for their movement. The relative isolation and clandestine atmosphere associated with resistance activities creates a continuing need for propaganda to support the effort. In peace or war, special forces units, by their very presence in a particular country, have a psychological impact on select military or paramilitary elements and on informed elements of the population. The image created by special forces personnel is molded by a multitude of factors which bear heavily on the successful outcome of the operation. These factors include tangible evidence of United States interest and support of the people by the presence of special forces personnel, the results of day-to-day, face-to-face meetings, and an intelligent understanding of the objectives and problems of the indigenous guerrilla force. The image is more favorable, however, if psychological operation techniques are used at all stages in the organization of the guerrilla units, especially in the pre-infiltration stages, to prepare the potential guerrilla force and auxiliary forces for the arrival of United States personnel, and subsequently in pointing up mutual efforts to achieve common political and military objectives. This new focus imposes additional burdens on the detachment commander, requiring him to have a detailed knowledge of psychological operations capabilities and the imagination to use them within the peculiar operational environment in which he is immersed. The psychological implications of unconventional warfare make a knowledge of psychological operations important. This is particularly true when special forces operations are predominantly psychological operations, such as the initial phases of informing guerrilla units and seeking to win the assistance of supporting elements. This chapter outlines how psychological operations assist special forces units in carrying out their missions, helping to maximize the chances for success and thereby contributing to a shortening of the conflict. Concept and organization. Planned psychological operations assist in the conduct of unconventional warfare operations both before and during hostilities and through those Cold War activities in which the United States Army may be engaged. These psychological operations are designed to create, reinforce, or sustain those attitudes held by the population which cause them to act in a manner beneficial to their own and to United States objectives. A. National programs. The United States Information Agency, USIA, conducts psychological operations which have the broad objective of generally defining American principles and aims and interpreting American and its people to others' people. This includes supporting the right of all the peoples of the world to choose their own form of government. USIA programs can be used to prepare potential or designated special forces operational areas for the psychological acceptance of American military personnel. B. Theater and service component commands. Army psychological warfare units are available within the overseas theater or command to assist in amplifying the broad policies and goals in the particular area in which unconventional warfare units are committed. During hostilities, a psychological operations staff officer coordinates with the Joint Unconventional Warfare Task Force to assist special forces detachments in their respective areas of operations. Planning for special forces operations includes the use of psychological operations in all phases of the unconventional warfare operation, from the psychological preparation stage through demobilization. Target audiences. A. Enemy target audience. The enemy target audience may consist of several elements. Now, I'm going to finish this up just in a moment. Let me just briefly touch on what we've talked about already and help you understand. So, I've talked about the general purposes. The book talks about the general purposes of psychological warfare, unconventional warfare involving, different factors, the ideological and political factors associated with the resistance activity and the propaganda. The peace or war special forces units and their presence and the impact they have. And then I went on to talk about the concept and organization of psychological operations. Now, if you need to go back and review this, if you don't understand how this connects to gang stalking, you're foolish. There's pre-infiltration psychological operations, for example. There's pre-war psychological operations. There's during war, and there's post-war psychological operations. So gang stalking has to do with a greater military agenda, the greater globalist agenda, and it is psychological warfare that is carried out as part of the defense budget, which is over $600 billion, if I'm not mistaken. Now, if you are a dumb cop or a provocateur, you might say, well, what does this have to do with anything? This establishes firmly the way the power structure thinks, and that the army, the military, is an active component of maintaining the order or organization, as they put it, of a nation. Target audiences. A. Enemy target audience. The enemy target audience may consist of several elements. 1. Enemy military forces. A. Enemy military forces may be of the same nationality as the population, or they may represent an occupying foreign power. In either case, the guerrilla force and the auxiliary personnel supporting them attempt to make enemy soldiers feel isolated and unsupported by pointing up any inadequacies in their supplies and equipment and their perennial danger of death. By focusing on the enemy's soldier's frustrations, psychological operations can lower his morale and reduce his effectiveness, particularly in conjunction with the powerful pressures generated by continuous combat action. Ambushing supply columns, sniping, small-scale raids against isolated units, cutting enemy communication lines, and the destruction of vital objectives at night induce a basic feeling of inadequacy, insecurity, and fear in the enemy soldier. Talk about terrorism, right? This feeling of inadequacy and fear permit easy access to the mind with the several tools of psychological operations and make the enemy soldier vulnerable to appeals urging surrender, malingering, or desertion. The enemy soldier's feeling of isolation and his receptivity to our appeals are further aided through leaflets and broadcast messages which stress the popular support of the aims of the guerrillas. The psychological isolation campaign may be supplemented by a more positive technique designed to elicit more readily observable reactions. If the Special Forces commander desires to induce enemy soldiers to defect or desert, satisfying the realistic goals must be introduced to attract the target audience. The enemy soldier should be told why and how he should defect, and given assurances concerning his safety and welcome by the guerrilla force. When enemy soldiers are taken by the guerrillas, promises of safety and good treatment must be kept. Proof of good treatment is passed on to enemy units by photographing the soldier, having him sign leaflets, or even having him make loudspeaker appeals to his former comrades. If these techniques are unfeasible, auxiliary personnel may inform enemy units by word of mouth of the well-being of defected or captured personnel. Obviously, the defection of an enemy soldier is important news to his former colleagues, since it indicates to those remaining behind that a defector's safety is assured. This fact can have a great psychological impact on the enemy and on guerrillas themselves. The enemy is made to feel that his own comrades are wavering and do not support the enemy goals, while the guerrillas learn that the enemy is weakening and their own chances for success increasing. Civilian collaborators. Number 2. This is key. Civilians in the operational area may be supporting a puppet form of government or otherwise collaborating with an enemy occupation force. Themes and appeals disseminated to his group vary accordingly, but the psychological objectives are the same as those of the enemy military. An isolation program designed to instill doubt and fear may be carried out, and a positive political action program designed to elicit active support of the guerrillas also may be effected. If these programs fail, it may become necessary to take more aggressive action in the form of harsh treatment. Harsh treatment of key collaborators can weaken the collaborators' belief in the strength and power of their military forces. This approach, fraught with propaganda dangers, should be used only after all other appeals means have failed. If used, they must be made to appear as though initiated and effected by the guerrillas to reduce the possibility of reprisals against civilians. B. Civilian population. 1. Now this is all key. This also justifies terrorist attacks on civilians if you're paying close attention. They're no longer terrorist attacks, but acts of war by a guerrilla army. Anyway, 1. No guerrilla movement can succeed without a majority of the population being favorably inclined toward it. Often, however, in the initial stage of hostilities, the population, because of fear or uncertainty about the aims of the movement, may be neutral or opposed to the guerrillas. This is understandable because the population is caught between the demands and controls of the enemy force and those of the guerrillas. In this instance, the main objective of psychological operations in guerrilla warfare is to persuade the target group that the guerrillas are fighting for the welfare and goals of the population, that these goals are attainable, and that the United States is supporting the guerrilla force is pressing for the same political and social goals. Psychological programs aimed at the target audience stress appeals designed to induce the population to support and obey the guerrillas in achieving recognized common objectives. By their presence in the operational area, Special Forces personnel are able to gather exploitable information on the immediate situation and on the attitudes and behavior of the local population. The guerrilla force and its supporting elements are a valuable storehouse of information which can be used to strengthen psychological operations plans directed at civilian and enemy target audiences. Armed with this information, the Special Forces commander can then request support from the theater psychological operations officer to assist in carrying out a predetermined and coordinated psychological program. This support may take the form of dropping newspapers and other semi-official media to the population, supplying the guerrillas with material to produce printed matter, and providing the Special Forces commander with additional advice and techniques to conduct a detailed and integrated psychological program to supplement the guerrilla operation. C. Guerrillas and the auxiliaries. The third major target audience to be considered by the Special Forces commander comprises the guerrillas, the auxiliaries, and those underground elements assisting the guerrillas. The guerrilla force has been given proof that the United States supports the general objectives of the guerrilla movement, but as the representative of the United States theater commander, the Special Forces detachment commander must ensure that specific goals for the guerrillas and its support elements are reinterpreted and reemphasized continually during the hostilities phase. Now, I'm going to have to stop it right here. I basically went over the guerrillas and the auxiliaries, targeting the civilian population with propaganda and pretty much controlling their sentiments and attitudes. They use the term attitudes in order to, assist the guerrilla operation, and also telling them that the most powerful government on earth is on their side and that they're right and this is best for their country. Okay, so in the first clips, I went over Psychological isolation campaigns, talking about the difference between occupying forces, some of them being foreign powers that are occupying, some are just the local government. And I talk about the auxiliaries, okay, the guerrillas, the auxiliary forces, the underground movements and underground elements, and the different detachments, okay. And remember, they talk about predetermined and coordinated psychological programs, okay, one main program in general, and the sub-projects or sub-programs therein. So now I'm going to go into types of psychological warfare operations in guerrilla warfare operational areas. A. Action operations. Action operations are those operations taken by the Special Forces commander which are designed to have a psychological effect on any of the three major target audiences. As indicated above, some combat actions may be initiated by the Special Forces commander purely for psychological purposes, especially those related to raising the morale of the guerrilla fighters or to manifest guerrilla support of the people. The purpose of these actions is to reinforce belief in the strength of the guerrilla force and in the rightness of their goals. These beliefs, when held by the population, open up sources of food and information required for the survival of the guerrilla force. Enemy credence in the strength of the guerrilla force tends to lower his morale and weaken the efficiency of his operations. Examples of actions initiated primarily for psychological reasons that can be taken by the Special Forces commander are: 1. Assisting the civilian population by distributing and administering medical supplies. 2. The rescue and evacuation of key civilians supporting the guerrilla cause. 3. Warning the civilian population of impending aircraft or missile attacks in the local area. These warnings imply guerrilla control over the operation and further increase the belief in the strength of the guerrilla force. 4. When area supremacy is achieved, encouraging and assisting the civilian population to resume their normal activities. This may involve use of the guerrillas or auxiliary units in assisting the local population to repair buildings, build needed structures, harvest crops, reopen schools and churches, organize social activity groups, etc. The institution of honest and effective government in the area, which is number 5. These psychological programs must carry the full weight of the prestige and legality of the United States and its allies. This is demonstrated by having appropriate directives emanate from the United States authorities at theater level or higher. Joint directives issued by United States and indigenous guerrilla leaders or a credible government in exile give added force to the action programs. Meeting civilians face to face. During those periods of operations before the Special Forces commander can actively assist the civilian population to resume a relatively normal life, the commander must reinforce written appeals by conducting meetings or discussions with the local civilians. These provide additional tangible evidence to the population that the guerrillas are supported by the United States and that both are working in the interests of the population. Members of the Special Forces detachment participate in such meetings to establish full rapport with the population, thereby diminishing the foreignness of Special Forces personnel. These meetings help identify the guerrillas and the United States personnel within the population. Printed media. The leaflet, poster, or bulletin is the most common and most effective type of printed material used by the Special Forces commander and the guerrillas in the operational area. Small printing presses and other simple types of reproducing machines can be used to print leaflets and new communiques. The technical problem associated with printing may be considerable and dissemination of the leaflets difficult in those areas where the enemy is able to maintain firm control. In the initial stages of hostilities, when psychological operations are most vital, guerrilla forces may not have the facilities to produce large amounts of printed material. The techniques of leaflet writing for unconventional operations are the same as those for conventional programs. Guerrillas aided by the Special Forces commander can usually select themes which are more timely, more credible, and more consistent than those which emanate from sources outside the operational area. These Special Forces commander can augment the locally prepared program by having small newspapers dropped into the area to supplement bulletins issued through auxiliary unit channels. Printed materials should be used to emphasize favorable aspects of civic action programs already undertaken. War aims should be publicized as aspects of permanent national aims and policies and disseminated as official-looking leaflets. Leaflets carrying the official text of joint communiques signed by the theater commander and known resistance leaders should be official and formal in appearance when issued to the target audience. We talk about the theater of war, the theater commander. Okay, talk about, there's a lot of attention paid to the media, to attitudes, to reassuring the population. And it's the same here when you look at the war effort. Propaganda and psychological operations are part of the war effort. So when somebody says that America is the biggest terrorist of all, and they're an American in America, it is taken away from the war effort, not just with American drone strikes and troops, but with the American allies on the ground and their auxiliaries in Syria and Iraq, for instance. C. Rumor. Rumor can be an effective propaganda device, especially when employed to disseminate black propaganda. The Special Forces commander, using guerrillas and auxiliary information channels, can initiate rumor campaigns in the operational area if the situation calls for them. Okay, this is key. This is absolutely key. Talk about smear campaigns and gang stalking. Where do you think they get it from? They get it from the military-industrial complex. Okay, and the psychologists that work in the psychological operations units and the propaganda units. Anyway, themes that the Special Forces commander will be reluctant to sanction as official information can be spread through the medium of rumor. Although rumors are difficult to control and the target audience never specifically isolated, this medium does have the advantage of being virtually impossible to trace. Since this device is also exploitable by the enemy, rumors which are detrimental to the guerrilla force should be countered by leaflet or face-to-face meetings with selected members of the civilian population. Absolutely, this idea is applied domestically all the time to maintain internal organization and the philosophies of this satanic nation. By the time you're done with this, if you don't realize that the military is the enemy, you weren't paying attention. Unless, of course, you're a Satanist and you agree with human trafficking, pedophiles, and you side with the biggest terrorist nation on the planet, and you don't care that America sides with Israel and abuses Palestinians, and worse, and you agree that 65 million preventable deaths is okay, just like the eugenicists such as Cass Sunstein, Bill Gates, Rockefeller, Kissinger, and all these lowly dogs. Anyway, 152, psychological operations to support demobilization. Psychological operations are used to assist in the demobilization of a guerrilla force. They consist of programs using all media to explain to the guerrilla steps to be taken in the demobilization process. In addition, rehabilitation programs sponsored by the United States or the national government concerned are explained to the guerrillas with emphasis on the guerrillas' role in the future plans for their country. In general, psychological operations aid in the orderly transition of the guerrilla force to more normal pursuits and prepare the civilian population for the return of guerrilla elements. So, just to go over this once again, I talked about general warfare, okay, and social action, okay, and how guerrillas are soldiers who believe in violent change as a mean of social action. Okay, when the Americans are trying to overthrow a government abroad, they put an emphasis on violent change as a means of social action. Okay, and then they turn around and talk about non-violent protests in their own country in order to maintain the internal organization of a nation. They know there's no way that nonviolence is going to change this controlled, opposition fucking dwelling nation of heathens. Anyway, I talk about the ideological and political factors and the isolation and clandestine atmosphere associated with resistance activities. And obviously, secret societies are also called clandestine and surreptitious groups, and those words are used here. Clandestine groups do clandestine activities. Secret societies and the intelligence community are one and the same. One day you will grow up to realize that. In peace or war, special forces units, by their very presence in a particular country, have a psychological impact. And I talk about how they're concerned with that impact and controlling the impact that it has and trying to make it a positive impact when they side with the guerrilla force. I talk about the concept and the organization. Well, I read it from the book, and they talk about it. The national programs, theater and service component commands. I talk about the target audiences. The book mentions the enemy military forces and how to run smear campaigns against them and urge surrender, malingering, or desertion. We look at the corporate America. It's funny how you have products in manufacturing facilities that are called defective, and they are discarded. So when you look at an army and they're trying to get these soldiers from the opposing army to defect, it's funny how they use the same words, but they have the same meaning. They talk about the theater of war, the theater commander. And of course, there's the theater and the Greek plays, and a bunch of secret societies are interested in plays and theater and playing dress up bitch. Anyway, moving on. Talk about isolation, psychological isolation campaigns is one of the points here. It's B. It starts off by saying the psychological isolation campaign may be supplemented by a more positive technique designed to elicit more readily observable reactions. Talk about civilian collaborators, the civilian population, the guerrillas and the auxiliaries, action operations to reinforce the belief in the strength of the guerrilla force and the rightness of their goals. I mean, if you don't understand how this relates to gang stalking, look. You have been deemed defective. So they are experimenting with different psychological operations, but they also intend to get rid of you because something you think or something you have done is challenging the internal organization of America, which is being upheld by the secret societies here that are allowed to operate because what they are doing is conducive to what the government's agenda is for its citizens. Or else they would have been broken down the way the Black Panthers and countless other groups were. The CIA starts cults with the purpose of stigmatizing, anti-government groups and quote-unquote religious fanatics because these are the very people by the book who challenge governments. That's the only challenge to their power, so they stigmatize them themselves. They infiltrate and they set up these groups so they can stigmatize them. Okay? So they can, and that's what Masonry says flat out. It says that Masonry is waging a war against fanaticism, which is really being devout. And I've shown you time and time again how these people say that Muhammad, for example, was schizophrenic and he is affecting his followers psychologically and leading them to bad mental health, by doing what he did. Okay? And it's the same thing that they're working their way to say the same thing about Jesus. That Jesus was either didn't exist or he was mentally ill, and he's convinced, billions of Christians all over the world to, have a negative stance on homosexuality, depending on how you look at it, to, oppress women by expecting them to be stay-at-home mothers, to reinforce a patriarchy that oppresses women, to go against abortion, and so on and so forth. See, when you truly look at what is going on, look, I promise you, if you are a good human being, America is the enemy. The army is the enemy. The military, the intelligence communities, law enforcement, the pathetic education system, mental health, secret society, civilian collaborators, gang collaborators, organized criminal collaborators, controlled political group collaborating pieces of shit, social media sites collaborating filth, and all other scumbags such as stores and businesses that collaborate with these lowly dogs. Fuck corporate America. Fuck deism. Fuck the philosophies of America. Fuck spiritual bottom feeders. God is greater, and if you are not willing to die for God, then you ain't shit.